Thank you very much, Holly. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. A topic that I think a lot of us are talking about right now. I know we see a lot of very sensational headlines in popular media. Every few days you have a CEO saying that, hey, nobody needs to come back to work ever. Everybody can work from wherever they want. Other CEOs saying, well, you all need to be back in the office. Very, very confusing, lots of questions. It's great for the CEOs to go out there and say nobody's going to be back in the office. But what does that really mean for the folks on the ground who are actually going to make sure that businesses stay compliant? And that's what I'm very excited about talking about today with both Melissa as well as Richard. But before I go there, I love numbers, so always like to throw out some numbers just to be able to put some things into context. A lot of times I get asked the question, do I believe that this hybrid work or this distributed work, remote work, whatever we want to call it, is this here to stay? And though nobody really knows what will happen in the future, what we do know is the sentiment that we are seeing in the marketplace. About 75% of those that we surveyed basically said that they generally enjoyed working from home. 80% said that they want the flexibility on where and when they can work. Almost 70% said that they actually have an improved work-life balance while working from home. Another 55% said that the ability to work remotely outside the home state or country that they live in for a short period of time is important to them. With the Great Resignation, the ability to be able to retain and attract talent has become a strategic issue for most boards and most executive teams. But with this ability to give people the opportunity to work from wherever they want, whenever they want, potentially also outside of their home jurisdiction, obviously comes with some risks. Now, in another survey that we did, we actually asked HR professionals, what do you think? Where are your employees working from? And what most, 90% plus of HR professionals were actually confident that they know where their employees were working. 80% believe that their employees are actually self-reporting days that they were working outside of their home state or country. When we asked the same question of the employees, the picture looked very different. Only 33% of employees actually claimed to be self-reporting days that they spent working outside of their home jurisdiction, even though 60% were aware that failing to report days spent outside of their jurisdiction had implications, compliance implications for the company. So with this, stark difference in where employers are and where what employers think they know and where employees want to do, we actually have a fairly big gap. And that's why I'm going to actually ask Melissa the question, Melissa, what do you think business leaders are doing to respond to this emerging trend around people now wanting to do work anywhere, whenever they want?
Yeah, thank you, Nishant. So as you can see from this slide, I've really seen, our clients and the other organizations that we speak to fall into one of three camps. I think there's sort of the first camp, which we, very coyly call panic and doom and gloom, but they are the companies that perhaps infamously have said, we're going to be 100% back in the office and that's the way it's going to be. And, there's very specific reasons for why that is. So they tend to have a little bit more of a unilateral approach, and they kind of paint the picture that unless and until we do this, we're going to have a real problem. The second camp, which is the one that excites me the most, I think, is those that approach it as a business opportunity to say, are there new employment models that now open up? For example, we've seen companies start to explore boundaryless recruiting and looking at expanded talent pools and revisiting what it means to be effective in a role if it's not, time in a seat in an office. So that's sort of the second camp. And the third camp is something that we're seeing a lot of, especially with the Delta variant and just the continued unknowns in the global pandemic, is this kind of wait and see. So a lot of organizations have come out and said, this is our short-term policy, but they've refrained from really kind of putting down stakes on what they're going to be doing for the long term. And I think it's because there is just so much uncertainty. If we go to the next slide, I think it's helpful sometimes just to kind of provide some context of what we're seeing, in the marketplace and how this is manifesting in terms of workforce policy. As you might expect, there's three main policies that we've seen emerge. There's the full in-office, there's the full remote or virtual on the other end of the spectrum, and then of course there's the hybrid, which tends to be, I think, the most popular one. We've included some quotes there so you can see, very prominent organizations have kind of taken stances in each of these three camps. So we certainly have representatives of all three. And each of these models comes with, some pros and cons. There really is no perfect model. There's no silver bullet, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later about how do you go about deciding which is the best for your particular organization. But if we start with, the full in-office model, some of the pros there are ones that you might expect. So we definitely see higher employee engagement and collaboration. Two areas in particular that are really powerful reasons to at least have some, being portion of your workforce being back in the office is this concept of experiential learning. A lot of our clients and what we've seen have reported that you've got a lot of employees that are maybe doing like the desktop learning and certifications, but they're missing out on some of the true leadership development type learning that comes from just observing, experiencing, interacting, which is a little bit more difficult in a remote setting. Another pro is creativity and innovation. This is another one where, and perhaps the reason why Reed Hastings said that Netflix has to be, in person is this idea of creativity and innovation. Certainly, there's been a lot of digital tools that have been rolled out to try and help fill that gap in a remote world. But some of the research that we've seen really seems to indicate that there isn't really a full and equitable replacement for being in the office when it comes to those dimensions. So being back in the office, that's definitely a pro. And then the last thing I'll call it on the pro side is really this idea of customer experience. I think sometimes companies have a tendency to look or over-index on exactly what the employees want and what the employees are thinking, and not necessarily thinking about some of their key external stakeholders. So being back in the office, especially if there is a component of face-to-face interaction with your customers, that can be a pro. Some of the cons here are, clearly those employees who prefer more flexibility, having a really strong stance to say 5 days in the week in the office, might not go over well. There's also, of course, the cost component of, having to maintain all that infrastructure. When we move on to the full remote or virtual model, in some cases, it's almost like the mirror opposite of the full in office. So some of the benefits are having kind of that unlimited talent pools, being able to draw from, maybe different markets where you don't necessarily have an office space or had an office space. There can be some opportunities for cost savings and reducing some of your infrastructure, office space, rent, things of that nature. And it can promote a little bit more of an innovative take on how you measure employee performance, focused more on outcomes versus necessarily, time in the office. But some of the drawbacks are ones that are pretty big drawbacks. There's clearly a security challenge when you've got this many, certain amount of employees dialing in remotely, accessing your networks. So that's been a consideration that we've seen. Certainly the innovation and experiential learning that I just mentioned as pros for the full office or full in office, those are cons, as you might expect in the full remote or virtual. I think one of the challenges we also see with remote and virtual is this idea of maintaining or curating a really positive employee culture. Because of the lack of visibility and the challenges of having employee touch points at scale, it can be really difficult to try and really craft that culture or even maintain the culture that you had pre-pandemic. And then, of course, there's the CX component of full virtual. Does that work for your customers and other key stakeholders like business partners, alliance partners? When we look at the last option of the hybrid model, some of the pros there is that it tends to be the most preferred model by most employees. And it also obviously has, some of the pros for the other two models. Most notably is potentially some cost savings, being able to reduce some of your office space or footprint in that regard. Some of the unique challenges for a hybrid model tend to be logistical. How do you manage a hybrid, remote, and in-person workforce when it comes to meetings, when it comes to performance management? How do you ensure parity of opportunity and make sure that you're developing all your employees and giving them all the same, types of opportunities? That can be very difficult. There's logistical complications, especially if you've got a really flexible hybrid policy where anyone can choose on a day-to-day basis when they come into the office. It can be very difficult to predict what your head count's going to be and what the associated, shared services impact might be. And then again, going back to the customer experience is something I always want to make sure our clients don't lose sight of is, how is that going to impact how they interact with you? How do you continue to provide a seamless experience for those key stakeholders? So I guess against this backdrop, I'd love to turn it over to Richard to maybe talk about, some of the implications then to an organization as they think through these different models.
Thanks, Melissa. So as a tax person, throughout the duration of the pandemic, I've been talking about the centrality of tax to the planning. As Melissa's highlighted, there's a real range of issues that companies need to grapple with as they consider what is the best approach for them. But tax is absolutely critical. And yet one of the points that has been raised and continues to is, well, this, when we're looking at tax, is it not just an issue for the employee if they're not in the office location? And that ultimately really isn't the case. The landscape that we have for taxes makes this particularly challenging. There's been an awful lot of shifting of dynamics when we consider taxes as they apply to hybrid working, remote working, and the different scenarios that came through in new normals during the pandemic. But really, we've had this seismic shift in the way that workforces operate and where workforces are based. And yet the tax landscape where we find ourselves now really hasn't transformed in the same way. A lot of the time in a pre-pandemic world, when companies were looking at requests by employees to work remotely for personal reasons, that would be a challenging situation, and a lot of those arrangements just weren't supported where there wasn't a business rationale. That doesn't play out in the environment that we have now. And so companies, tax professionals, HR professionals, mobility are being asked to do something very, very different in a world from a tax perspective that really isn't changed in the same way. So what you see on the slide then are just some of the considerations that we need to think about when companies are looking to embrace hybrid working. The location of where an employee is based is going to have an impact, whether that be a different location domestically in the United States or a different location internationally. Depending on whether there is a local entity or not, there may be registrations, corporate tax filings and exposure, profits being drawn into tax regimes overseas. Payroll may need to be registered and operated, and that can have the impact that companies become liable for employee taxes. And really the onus and the emphasis is going to be on the company, the employer, to know where its people are. The statistics that Nishant shared earlier are really pertinent here in whether an organization really understands where its people are or not, and then obviously what is the implication of that. So even for domestic companies in the United States, very commonly the employee population, the demographics aren't necessarily just a domestic headcount. And so as we've seen through the pandemic, and as we continue to see, companies are becoming international by virtue of the employee population that they have, this desire to work remotely, whether on a long-term basis or even on a temporary basis. And so there is that increase in the challenges, there's that increase in needing to accommodate, again, as was mentioned earlier, these arrangements where companies are hiring internationally now that you've got a talent pool that doesn't have the same geographic limitations, but the tax considerations are there. So while it is and can be something of a minefield, really what we're looking to do is to make sure that companies understand how to navigate a path through the complexity. And we'll talk through some of that. And then what are the tools to be able to do that? So, Nishant?
Well, that's great. Thank you, Richard. Hopefully that sets up some very nice context. And maybe we build on some of the things that we just talked about. Melissa, maybe I start with you. So you obviously, indicated that lots and lots of different return to work models are being talked about. If you take a step back and, given all this work that you've been doing with leading organizations, have you been able to pull out some universal implications from all this talk? And if yes, then are there also any additional considerations that you layer on top of that that may be very specific to certain industries and company cultures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think the first piece of advice and sort of the universal truth that I encourage all of my clients to explore is really this concept of know thyself. Really understanding what is your current culture and how does that ultimately align with your strategy. The reason why that's important is that your culture is not the same today as it was 18 months ago, sort of pre-pandemic. Invariably, there's been some impact to it. So understanding what that impact is and how ultimately your go-forward policy is either going to help or hinder your culture and therefore your strategy is something that'll be really important to understand. For example, if you are an organization that likes to think that you're very innovative or you have an innovation-based strategy to mandate that employees come in 5 days a week and have very, kind of rigid hours, that can feel very jarring and inauthentic based on the culture and the strategy that an organization is trying to drive. So that's just a lens that I think it's important for everybody to understand. The second thing I would say is, and you might have picked up on this on the slide that I presented about the 3 different models, all 3 models are going to create churn. Like the minute you declare a policy, you're going to have some employees that just are not bought in to that particular policy. And obviously, given the great resignation, we've seen that come true in a very real way. So the answer cannot be, I'm going to try and please all employees, because you won't do that. So the answer has to be, I need to try and please the most important employees. And when I say the most important, it's the ones who are most valuable from an overall strategic perspective. So the key there is knowing who are your most valuable employees, who are your high potentials, who are the ones that are driving the most impact for your organization, and then understand what those preferences are. And to the extent there's a gap between the preference and ultimately what the policy has to be, you can then take very targeted proactive measures to try and smooth that transition for them, because again, the key there is retention. The last thing that I'll say is, regardless of what the policy is, it's really important to communicate sort of the reasons why to your employees. Again, for the reason I noted, that you're not going to please everybody. You can mitigate some of the potentially negative perceptions by explaining kind of the reasons and the rationale for why you need to be in person. It's not enough to just say, well, I think you're more effective in person. When you're able to kind of say, look, like, we're an innovation company, we need creativity, we feed off of each other's ideas and that organic interaction. Therefore, that is why we need to have a few days in the office that are designated as innovation days, or days where we're getting together as teams to be creative. That is an incredibly important message to deliver. Another example is, why we can't go full remote. There could be some legitimate customer experience issues where we need to be in front of the customer. There could be a cybersecurity concern of just having that many remote employees accessing your network. Whatever the rationale is, making sure that that is communicated as sort of a reason for why the policy is what the policy is incredibly important, just from a change management and retention perspective.
Those are some very wise words. I appreciate you sharing those. As a follow-up on that, so as companies think about this is obviously quite a challenging beast to get arms around. And so in a number of my own conversations, I find even some of the largest companies struggle with where to start. And what are some of the most pressing questions that these companies need to address at the earliest so that they are staying ahead of the talent game? So any guidance for the audience as to, what are some of the key questions that they should be, that companies should be addressing immediately?
Yeah, I mean, I think the emergence of the Delta variant, months ago is one area that I think created a lot of uncertainty. So I think it's trying to pull the organization out of being a very reactive and schizophrenic, type mode, and really focusing on more of the long term. It's very easy because of all the twists and turns of the pandemic to get caught into what seems right today and not what's right tomorrow. So I think you need to, I coach my organizations on the idea that uncertainty is going to continue. So you need to take a stance on, are you going to continue to be fluid in your policy, or are you just going to start to chart a path forward, knowing that there is going to be some uncertainty and some variation in how that, may pan out over the course of the next year or more. So the question really is, how aggressive do you want to be with the policy given some of these uncertainties? The other sort of key area that I would say is, how far are you willing to go to retain employees? I've seen a lot of companies fall into the trap of, not being really proactive or aggressive with trying to retain employees, and then seeing their turnover costs escalate because it can be so expensive to replace a full-time employee. It can be as much as 200% of whatever that employee was making. And so doing proactive retention bonuses, looking at creative perquisites to try and help, really enhance that employee value proposition, in many cases can be a less expensive option rather than trying to backfill for employees that have left.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the companies that are getting to these right kinds of questions, are there any best practices that you were able to share so that companies can stay ahead of the curve?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to have a good sense of kind of what your employee perceptions are, both currently as well as kind of what the perceptions are relative to the different policy options that are on the table. I think most importantly, you need to understand ultimately where you're headed as an organization and what your strategy true north is, and ultimately craft your policy as a way to enable and accelerate the realization of that strategy. So I think that's the most important thing. Invariably, what I found is that companies tend to have a picture of themselves and of their culture that isn't maybe 100% accurate. Frequently, there's a gap between sort of the leadership and management layers and then the rank and file. So really kind of having a mechanism to have kind of that listening mechanism to understand what's happening with the reality on the ground is incredibly important. And the other thing I would say too is make sure that you're looking at all dimensions for charting the path forward. I mentioned earlier that a lot of companies will fall into the trap of really focusing on what employee preferences are. And employees, because they're human beings, can be very fickle. And we're experiencing that ourselves where, we've heard that certain employees want to come into the office and they want that interaction. And yet when we have a hybrid policy, we're not seeing people come in droves like we might have expected. So it's really, asking the broader picture. The employee, preferences is one leg of that stool, but two other legs are what's practical, in terms of, what's feasible from a logistics, security perspective, all the dimensions we talked about. But then the most important is what's going to be effective for our business. What do our customers need? What are the true outcomes that we're trying to drive? And how can our policy ultimately accelerate that and clearly, not hinder it?
There's some really, really wise advice there. Thank you so much, Melissa. Hey, Richard, I'm going to switch over to you. As we talked about earlier, some companies have gone out and just said, hey, employees can now work from anywhere they want for as long as they want. given all the implications that you just talked about, how do you think that will work realistically from a compliance perspective?
I think it comes down to the fundamental, do you know where your employees are? Because you're going to get complexities based upon, where you think they're working, where they actually are working, and then, where they're not working. And so a lot of companies, exactly to Melissa's point, perhaps earlier on in the pandemic and as we were starting to emerge, approach this as, you can work from anywhere. We've proven the levels of employee satisfaction, etc., have been high with these arrangements. And so fundamentally, again, as these companies plan, as they chart that path forward, as they negotiate through and balance all those competing priorities, where they're looking at working and allowing people to work outside of what was their home office, as in the location they were tied to originally. The big challenge is understanding what the tax ramifications are for the company, as an employer, for the individuals as well, and then trying to understand, well, actually, what is our tolerance? What are we getting ourselves into in these kind of approaches? So it is very challenging. The policy is one thing, putting parameters on, paper, so to speak, is another. The actual execution is really part of that difficulty. So as companies are looking to do this, it's really going to be done with a real clear understanding of what are the implications of the approach that you're considering. Do you have the capability to manage it? And from a risk profile perspective, are you confident that this aligns with how you as an organization want to approach the complexities and some of the risks from a tax perspective that may arise?
So, Rich, I'm going to push you on that just a little bit. Practically speaking, how would companies actually take that risk tolerance into account?
I'm sorry, how would they take
that risk tolerance into account?
So I think there's a number of different factors that organizations really need to consider. Part of it's going to come down to what is our geographic footprint? Who are the employees that want to relocate? And what is it that they're going to do in the countries or the other states that they may work from? How long do they want to work from these different locations? In the locations that they're working, what is the environment and the regulatory environment in terms of how amenable it is to remote working? Now that's employment law, immigration, as well as the tax considerations as well. So there's a real, it's understanding the different variables that apply. Now, when we take that into tax, it's looking at really what are the implications. If you have an individual working from another country, is that individual going to become a tax resident? Will they become taxable in that country? Does it confer payroll, registration, and withholding obligations? Is there a social security exposure? When you look at other countries outside of the US, what is the amount that you may become responsible for? What is the position of the authorities in pursuing companies for compliance, where you have people going in and there is a requirement to comply with local obligations? So I think you're looking to aggregate this to say, well, when that person goes to a different location, what is actually coming up there? What is it that we need to do? What is the risk? And then again, putting that into the context of, from a tax perspective, the United States has a network of bilateral tax treaties. They have bilateral social security agreements, albeit quite a number less. So there is the opportunity to do it really effectively within certain parameters based on the geographic footprint of the organization, where people can go and benefit from some of these bilateral agreements so they don't trigger a tax liability in that country, but doing it eyes open. So some countries are going to have a different risk tolerance. They may be happy for people to go overseas for a longer period of time. Others are going to be more conservative. Industry also plays a factor in that as well. And to the points that Melissa was making around creativity, in tech and more creative industries, we're seeing a greater desire to be remote and to be remote on a more permanent basis. So again, I think as companies match that, they've really got to understand as well, how does this translate to dollars? what is the risk that we're incurring when it comes to the taxes? How does that translate to dollars? And then how do we ring fence it? And again, all predicated on, the question that we go back to of where are my employees?
Yeah, which obviously is not that easy an answer, actually, as easy it might sound. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. If I may pick up on two threads from what you just said, you spoke a lot about US domestic, or at least you indicated a few times US domestic implications. Can you, I think we know, over the past, this whole issue around people working from different states and the non-resident implications of performing work in a non-resident jurisdiction it's been a known issue for many years. Mm-hmm. But companies have not really done anything to address it. So my question back to you, is it different this time around with this, potentially different ways of working, whatever we want to call it, remote hybrid work? Is it different, and what are the different implications that companies should finally sit up and pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's like a new old issue, that hot potato of, managing the risk you get from multi-state travel and withholding and who owns it. I think there's an argument to be said that, this is something that you've got state tax authorities looking to generate revenue. There's always been states that have been more active in targeting payroll compliance, multi-state withholding for employees traveling into working locations. And I don't think there's any reason to think that that's going to change in those locations. And if anything, we may see more states look to try and police and understand who's coming in and what the tax obligations are, and see, is this through audit an opportunity to drive more revenue to the state. So I certainly think that, the risk environment in a way has the potential to be different, just as much as it has the potential to be internationally. One of the challenges that we and our clients and other organizations face at the moment is what we're doing now is new. There isn't really a precedent for this scale of transformation in the workplace. And so correspondingly, knowing how authorities will respond and what that enforcement and audit environment may be in a year's time or so is very difficult. It'd be nice to have a crystal ball, but we don't. So it's really being very careful in trying to understand it. But the implications are, that if you're not meeting the obligations that you have as an employer, or you're bringing and conferring corporate risk, whether it be Nexus or other taxes, then it's really opening up to a lot of exposure that taxes are going to be levied in other states. And again, it's accruing a level of risk across different US states, internationally as well. Our companies allowing risk to accrue, financial risk that is either unquantified or known, and may just be unacceptable from an organizational perspective, going back to the earlier question on risk tolerance. So I think, Nishan, if I play it back to you, it'd be interesting from the conversations you've had and with what you've been doing, just to kind of get a sense as well as, how are companies, how are employers addressing this, and that role of technology in providing a solution.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I spend most of my time. Obviously, as companies think through various policies and various processes, at some point, you, as an organization, are going to need some way of being able to scale that process. And I think to do it without technology is going to be really hard. What we've seen is that over the last 18 months, as folks were just going into this pandemic mode, some of the more proactive companies, actually, to their credit, what they did was, they set up dedicated email boxes where if somebody wanted to go somewhere else and work a few days from a different jurisdiction, that they could actually send an email in saying, hey, I'd like to work from, Timbuktu for the next 30, 60 days. And then, the teams internally would manage that in Excel spreadsheets. And, for some of the more proactive ones, you basically could have up to 1,000, 2,000 people making these kinds of requests. And that was absolutely throwing, these folks in HR, folks in mobility, folks in tax, literally, all across the organization. There's this mad scramble to figure out, okay, can we say yes? Can we say no? How do we even figure out? Because not a lot of companies have had to answer these kinds of questions before. And so I think that's where I think technology can play a really, really important role. From my perspective, as I think about being able to manage something like this in future, there are a few different pieces of it. There is obviously the first piece around allowing employees to be able to request that they be able to work from somewhere else. Hopefully a solution that is more elegant than just doing it over emails and trying to manage that over emails. Interestingly, we just started working with a large fintech out on the West Coast. They actually took a very interesting approach. They said, look, not only do we want our people to be able to request where they work from, actually, we want them to figure out where should they work from. So we want them to be the ability to be able to go in and explore based on their lifestyle choices and quality of life and other parameters that we will have some influence over, and we can help narrow down. But we want people to be able to explore that. So that's one bucket of how do you even capture, how do you give people a mechanism to be able to request that they want to work from somewhere else. Because in the absence of providing that mechanism, what you can be sure of is that people will still go do what they want to do, except that the only difference is going to be that you as an organization are not going to have visibility into it. So that's the first piece. The second piece really is around, okay, if you do have an employee who is coming in and saying, I want to work from somewhere else, there needs to be some mechanism of triaging it. If both Richard and I go in and say, hey, we want to be working from London for the next 30 days, there is no need to go and do that assessment again and again. There may be some learnings from the first one that can be learned and then be used for future cases, assuming obviously most of the facts and circumstances stay the same. So there is a need to be able to triage that. That triage can also include things like pre-approved cases. So there may be certain jurisdictions where you may either have a legal entity already, or where people may already have a work permit, or other criteria that you can put in place and say, if you request for under 30 days to go to the list of jurisdictions, then we can just auto approve, or we can auto decline. If somebody wants to go and work from Iran, no matter for how many days it is, then we're basically just auto declining. So there needs to be some sort of a mechanism to be able to auto triage the cases, because that will really take off a lot of the burden from the teams. Also, the triage doesn't always have to be a yay or nay, but it also needs to include just the ability to be able to figure out who in the organization needs to be involved. So for example, if I'm going to say that, hey, I just want to move from California to New York, we don't need somebody in mobility to look at it, or we don't need an assessment from an immigration perspective, or an A1 social security perspective, or from a posted worker notification perspective, or for some of the filing requirements that UK or Canada might have perspective, right? So you can then start to triage and say, okay, we only need the manager to say yes, and we probably need somebody in payroll to be able to figure out whether we already have a registered entity and whether we have a process for payroll in New York or not, and are we complying with labor laws, and is IT okay with it or not? So depending on the organization and depending on what constraints you want to put on it, there is an opportunity to be able to triage some of these things. Then the third piece is around, okay, now that we know that here are the 3 or 4 stakeholders within the organization that do need to be involved, how do we need a case management system, because most likely somebody in tax, somebody in mobility, somebody in HR, the manager, maybe somebody in IT, somebody in payroll, a number of different stakeholders now getting involved. And how do we even make sure that stuff is getting done, and we probably have some SLAs around being able to approve these things, and how do we just help these various functions internally to be able to manage all of that? So that's the third piece of it, a case management piece of it. And then the fourth piece of it is really around the data back into a lot of the systems which actually drive talent, right? So if I say, hey, I want to move to New York, and it gets approved, it actually needs to get reflected in the HCM system. So whether it's Workday or SuccessFactors, or whatever you may be using, it needs to get reflected in there to say, hey, as a result of that, here are some additional privacy, documents that need to be signed, which may not already be on file. The home jurisdiction needs to be switched to New York so that the right payroll withholding can happen. So things like that need to happen, basically need to be triggered in the HCM system. And then the last part of it is, okay, it's great that, we've approved the individual to go work from a different jurisdiction. Typically these, what at least we're seeing in the marketplace is that some of these may be permanent, that I may just move lock, stock, barrel from California to New York, but in some cases it may be time bound. It may be for 30 days or 60 days or 180 days, whatever the threshold may be. In that case, how are we actually monitoring that individual is coming back? Or, at some point in time, where is that check-in to be able to say, hey, we approved it for 30 days or 60 days. Now we're, 10 days away from that 30-day mark. And are you still on plan of coming back? Do we need to extend it? How do we even get into that conversation? Who's monitoring that? And how are we setting up the organization to be able to actually address it? So those are, I think, the 5 different pieces from a technology perspective that become very, very relevant as these policies get converted into processes, and those processes undoubtedly are going to need some form of tech potentially to be able to manage those things.
I mean, to the point, Nishant, that you mentioned about tracking as well. I mean, I think I'd flag, and again, maybe you can kind of talk to some of this, is, obviously we need to know where people are. It needs to be captured in HRIS. I think one of the key things from a tax perspective is understanding that it's not just there's not a binary, are you in a location, yes, no, and then there is a tax answer to that. The complexities that arise, there's a lot of nuance in that. If you take New York, for example, we've obviously seen plenty of people understandably go off to sunny places like Florida, which also have the benefit of having no state income tax. But again, the assumption that, well, I'm not in New York, I'm no longer a resident, I'm no longer subject to tax there. So I think one of the key things that we're seeing is, as you go through this process, how do you actually leverage technology that's going to be smart enough to manage some of that complexity? Again, with all of these things that we're doing, not having to kind of reinvent the wheel as each individual moves. So is that maybe something you can talk to just in terms of, what you've been working on or, solving for through the pandemic?
Yeah, and I think, so this is a multi-faceted beast, right? And a big part of this is going to be that every organization, this actually builds on what you said earlier, that every organization is going to come up with its own risk thresholds. And I think that's where, some of the work that we do together, where we go in and we're able to help the companies understand risk in different jurisdictions. That risk, may actually vary by different populations. The executive team, very different from sales team, very different from back office, for example, right? So different risks being presented by different populations. And I think the role of technology really here is to be able to take some of those risk considerations and being able to program them into the technology so that it actually reflects the advice that you may be providing or the policy that the company wants to implement. So I think that is a critical part of it, because yes, it is great that countries may have certain rules. Like we know that Brazil and the US, for example, don't have a treaty. So theoretically, day one, everybody should now, every company that has one employee going into Brazil, US-based employee into Brazil, should be doing compliance from day one. And I would never suggest that companies should not do that. But I think a lot of companies may come to the conclusion that that is not practical. And so I think that is a huge overlay on top of that. That together with what you just said around employee communication, I think that is another very, very important piece as we put these things in place. I have had so many conversations with companies and employees where employees think, oh, I was a resident of New York and I went to live for 3 months in Florida, taking your example. And so of course I'm not going to pay New York taxes for the whole year. I'm only going to pay them for for 9 months. And that's such an incorrect conclusion. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there isn't the right communication on some of these things. So great conversation there. I have a question that came into the Q&A. By the way, there's some really good questions coming in. So I would I really encourage the participants to ask, whatever you guys want. I'm going to spend the next, 8-10 minutes talking through the questions that you guys send in. We already have quite a few, but I'm going to pick from among the best here. But one of the questions that I saw coming in, and Richard, maybe this is for you, Melissa, if you think it's relevant to you as well, happy for you to jump in. But this individual, they're in Europe, and they're saying, am I correct in thinking that tax implications could occur based on how long someone is present in a country, regardless of the split between annual leave and remote working? And so how do the tax authorities monitor this and act on this? Would they contact the employee in the first instance, or would they reach out to the employer?
So it's a really great question. And the starting point on days is that you're often looking at just days of presence. Is somebody present in a country? And particularly when we're looking at those double tax treaties, they typically, as one of the criteria, will allow up to 183 days in a specified, typically a 12-month period, to be present there, meeting other conditions and not being subject to tax. And so, yes, you're often just looking at days of presence, whether it be remote work, weekends, some additional leave, it may be business trips that they've undertaken as well. So there isn't necessarily always going to be that differentiation, that ultimately a day is a day. Now that's not blanket, but I think it's a kind of a good starting point when you're looking at managing this. Now, the second piece of it in terms of, well, who does the responsibility sit with? And there's a number of answers to this. And a lot of it's kind of based on the fact that employers are being required to comply with the tax legislation within a country. And so there is an expectation that you have to understand what you've got to do. You have to kind of self-assess what your responsibilities are. And so as an employer, there is the requirement to know, well, I have employees in a jurisdiction and I have to understand what the resulting obligations are. By the same token, the individual has to understand, well, I'm now in this location. Am I subject to taxes? Do I have registrations, tax filing obligations? And that's not just, as I say, income tax. It's your payroll withholding, it's employment taxes, social security, it's compliance with posted worker directive, for example, within Europe. So it's not necessarily the case that the authorities will contact the employee. It's perhaps more the case that actually the individual and the employer are required to make the contact. They're required to make take that first step in order to be compliant. If the authorities are the ones kind of knocking on the door in the first instance, that may well be that they believe there are taxes due. Could well be that, at that stage, it's too late in the game. That's something that should have been addressed earlier. And again, the one thing I'd say is that different authorities have got different compliance obligations. Nishant and I have been talking about within Europe, compliance with A1 and social security, countries like Austria, for example, that have a very, very strict enforcement regime and may go on site to a plant, for example, and expect that employees can demonstrate with the having a copy of an A1 that they're not subject to social security. That isn't necessarily going to be the place, let's say, in Italy or Lithuania. So again, it comes down to those enforcement arrangements, but I think as a starting point, it's not waiting for the authorities, it's the company having the knowledge that somebody is there and determining what actions need to be taken. And again, understanding that what the company wants to do and the employee wants to do, the conclusions that they arrive at in terms of is somebody subject to tax or not, they may not be the same. And so that's one of the challenges that we find with hybrid working, we've experienced throughout the pandemic, that employees and employers may see things differently. And that's just something that you'll have to work through. And as a company, there's an obligation to do right by the organization to manage that organizational risk.
Richard, on that point, or maybe an extension of that, obviously we've talked a lot about the economic employer regime, very, very, very relevant in Europe, but sort of stepping back even one level higher than that from a permanent establishment perspective, especially with respect to BEPS and BEPS Article 7, the impact of that. Just curious to hear, how do you think all of that will evolve now that, you may have people who are performing work from the...
It's an interesting one, because I think if you look at international tax, it has been headline news. It's been an interesting time as a tax professional, that's for sure, to see kind of tax make front page news. But a lot of that is really focused on the corporate taxes. And I think there's been perhaps less focus and less desire and perhaps a sense of less necessity to address, well, how do we evolve a tax regime to accommodate this globalized workforce? It is a different globalized workforce than we had pre-pandemic. So I think the big challenge is, as I mentioned earlier, the rules and the regulatory environment is still very much the same as it was pre-pandemic. Obviously, there were changes during to allow some relaxations, but I don't know that we'll necessarily see any immediate changes around it without the kind of emphasis that you have on driving more equality around corporate taxes that we've seen through some of the recent initiatives. So again, I think for employers that puts, the folks who are listening into this, it's going to continue to be a tricky situation to manage. So again, it's around being able to navigate that path forward with what we have without necessarily seeing change. And that change, if any, might just be around a tighter enforcement environment.
That makes sense. One other thing that I'll just add, given the European question here, and I see there's a lot of folks from the UK who are dialed in. One of the other implications, obviously, starting in 2021, was the whole Schengen, with the Brexit, the whole implication from Schengen perspective. So, UK employees who could have just gone into EU or EEA and perform work for any amount of time, obviously that is no longer true. And, there is a need to be able to go back and reassess whether a visa or work permit may be needed. And, also the ability to make sure that employees are not spending more than 90 days in a rolling in a 6-month period, essentially in a rolling 6-month period. And it gets more complicated because you can be in like 3 different countries, and that counts with basically to 3 days from that 90-day count perspective. So it can get pretty tricky. I know we've been talking a lot about tax here, but there is certainly an implication from an immigration perspective, which is broader, but then specifically given this Brexit piece, there is also this big consequence from a Schengen perspective. And obviously happy to talk more about that with anybody who may be interested. One final question, given that we're 5 minutes away, and I think this is something that may be relevant. I'd be curious both Melissa, your and Richard's perspective, because I think you'll come at it from different points of view. The question is, what should I do if I learn that an employee has gone rogue and working remotely without any prior notification or approval?
Do you want to take that, Richard, or do you want me to jump in?
I will. Yeah, I mean, I think, the first point we've looked at is that kind of diagnostics of what is the situation, what's going to go on, and how do you want to tackle it. You have that this has now happened and understanding what it means and what you might need to do. But really it's then kind of looking to the future of, well, what is this an arrangement that's going to continue? Is it something that as an organization principally we'd like to support? And then it's around managing it. I think to maybe put it back to Melissa, obviously, if we look at this as a one-off, part of it may be, well, as an organization, how are we dealing with these situations from comms, strategy, policy? So I guess, Melissa, if you see these kind of situations come up, they obviously tie into a bigger whole. So if you have thoughts as to how an organization may tackle it from a strategy, direction of policy approach.
Yeah, I'd say first of all, it's rarely a one-off. I think so. If somebody has done it, chances are others are doing it, and you just don't know about it yet. So that's kind of the first thing. I think what I try and coach organizations on is you absolutely can update policy, you can double down on comms, you can do all of the usual things, but I really go back to culture as sort of your first and last line of defense. And so at the end of the day, you want to create a culture where employees are incentivized and bought in to doing the right thing, and whatever that right thing means for your organization based on your values and your stated policies and whatnot. So I think there's things you can look at in terms of, how do our comms, really reinforce these types of behaviors? How are we actually monitoring employee performance, rewarding behavior? Just, all of the things that you would do in terms of just trying to incentivize the right types of performance and behaviors, and making sure that you do have some guardrails and incentives there to ultimately try and drive the culture that you want. But ultimately it comes down to, we need to do the right thing and explain to them why it's the right thing, and the what's in it for them.
All right. This has brought us to the hour. Holly, did you have any parting words for the audience here?
Yeah, just to thank everyone for attending. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you to Nishant, Melissa and Richard. As I mentioned, I'll be sharing the recording shortly in a couple of hours. If you do have any other questions, you can go ahead and reach out, and I'll make sure the speakers get those questions. And other than that, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.